Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. I'm Bill Current, President and founder of the Current Consulting Group, and I'm joined today by Brien Feeley, Senior Vice President of the Current Consulting Group. Welcome, Brien.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning.
Morning. So we're going to be talking about oral fluid testing. It's one in a long series of podcast episodes that Brien and I are doing together on oral fluid testing. And today we're going to talk about the DOT oral fluid drug testing regulations as part of Part 40. There's a whole lot of complex issues involved in that. So we're going to talk about that. But I encourage you to visit our website at currentconsultinggroup.com to find more episodes of Currently Speaking through the website. You can also find us on YouTube, Amazon Audible, Apple, all the major podcast platforms. You'll find Currently Speaking there. And we encourage you to view past episodes, like it, share it, help us build our followership and enjoy these podcasts. We cover a whole variety of issues throughout the series of podcasts. So, and if there's something you want us to do a podcast on, email us and let us know, info@currentconsultinggroup.com, and we'd be happy to put together a podcast on that. But today we're going to talk about oral fluid testing and the DOT regulations. Now, Brien, for many, many years, the DOT regulations only permitted lab-based urine testing, over 30 years. And that started to change. So when did Part 40 or the HHS regulations adopt lab-based oral fluid testing?
Well, so the HHS, it's been going on a long time, Bill. As you know, I've kind of been involved in oral fluid testing for 25 plus years. And so they started looking at oral fluids really and drafting guidelines for them 20 plus years ago. And it took quite a while to get consensus on the scientific, really the properties or the standards that they wanted to have as part of the HHS or SAMHSA guidelines. So, but the final rules kind of went into effect, the HHS rules in October of 2019. And so that sort of set the guidelines for what they call the oral fluid mandatory guidelines in the SAMHSA registry. And so that started the clock really ticking on what people had to do to get compliant with those guidelines. And, it set up all the basic stuff that you had to do in terms of the science, the cutoffs for oral fluid, the standards, the things that labs would have to do to be certified, et cetera, et cetera. But what it also did importantly was it determined what the DOT was going to do and how they were going to look at those guidelines. Because as you probably know, and as some of our listeners may know, the DOT looks at those SAMHSA guidelines as their guidepost in terms of what they want to put into the mandatory guidelines or the rulemaking process for DOT testing. And so that started the clock for them. And basically that took them a few years to come up with the language for the DOT guidelines. But so to answer your question, we're looking at, basically since October of 2019, since there have been guidelines, but testing has not been able to take place yet because of some of the things we're going to talk about.
Well, I know that in your long career with OraSure Technologies, you've been very, very involved in sort of that whole process over the course of many years to try to, make the reality of federal guidelines something that, employers could eventually use. What was the holdup? Why did it take so long? Oral fluid testing's been around a long time, and OraSure Technologies, for example, had the Intercept device out there, which became the number one recognized brand in oral fluid testing years and years ago. What was sort of the holdup?
Well, so if you go back, without getting into all the history, I think that the wheels turn slow when it comes to adopting new technology in the federal government. There were lots of things, Bill. I mean, you had you had a variety of things that were resisting the change. For one, I mean, you have urine, which was the gold standard for so many years, and you had there was some resistance to there being another matrix because of probably just some of the staunch advocates of urine testing, and both from probably an economic standpoint and the stronghold that the urine testing laboratories and the industry just had. But you also had, I think, just a reticence on the belief of people to fully believe that oral fluid could be a matrix that could be used from a scientific standpoint. So you had to overcome a number of things, those economic issues, the science issues, and to really prove out that oral fluid had a place in the federal program and in DOT, and that the cutoffs could be validated, and that it had a place that I think that everyone could buy into from the science standpoint. And one of them was THC. I mean, I think as you know, there was a lot of debate about THC and passive exposure, environmental exposure, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a long sort of debate about whether one should be able to test for the parent, or should you have to test for the carboxy THC, which is the metabolite, because that would in fact rule out passive exposure. And then that tied into really trying to nail down whether or not it was there. You could test for the metabolite in oral fluid. And after many years and many studies, it was kind of determined that would be very hard to do for the standard laboratory to pick up metabolite in oral fluid. That if you went with a low enough cutoff in oral fluid for the parent drug, you could feasibly rule out contamination, environmental exposure. And so, long and short of it is, finally came to, I think, an overall consensus of what the cutoff should be with parent THC. And, all the other things were kind of put to bed, and finally they came to agreement. And I think there was lots of other issues too that we won't get into here, but it was just, it took too long, but we are there.
So explain to our audience the connection between the SAMHSA guidelines that came out in October 2019 and the DOT guidelines or regulations that came out last year and that we're still waiting to go into effect. Why is DOT dependent on the SAMHSA guidelines?
Well, I mean, basically the DOT looks to SAMHSA for guidance on the science side of things. That's basically they take that as their pretty much rule of thumb on what they're going to follow. But there is sometimes some exceptions. And in this case, there was. So they followed pretty much everything SAMHSA said in terms of cutoffs, and most of the science is pretty much adopted by DOT. The one thing that varies is the Department of Transportation has a long and older standing rule called OTETA, which has to do with the way, has to do with a lot of things, but one of them specifically related to sample collection is the way a sample is collected, a urine sample is collected and described in those rules. It's essentially a single sample that gets collected and then subdivided into two, an A and a B sample. And so the way the SAMHSA guidelines were written for the oral fluid collection device, they allowed for a sample to be collected with a device or devices that could be either a left and a right. So you could essentially be collecting two samples, an A and a B, or you could collect one now and then a second one 5 or 10 minutes later, getting two samples. And so DOT didn't allow for that, basically under that OTETA ruling, the omnibus ruling, and it had to really be a single sample collected and then subdivided into two. And so they just couldn't come to terms on that. And when you read the DOT rules, they basically call out that requirement, which is different than SAMHSA. So really, from a technical standpoint, you could be doing federal samples one way and DOT another. Now, in reality, I don't think we're going to see that. I think that the makers and the manufacturers are really coming up with a device that can be used the more stringent way with the DOT type regulations in mind. And then that will be used for both DOT and federal programs. And no one in their right mind is going to come up with a device just for federal testing because that's such a small niche market compared to DOT.
So the DOT final regulations for oral fluid testing are out, but
Right.
are they available? Can employers use them? And if not, what's the holdup?
Unfortunately, not quite yet. So the holdup is that once they, created their final rules, they went into the Federal Registry, and everyone had a chance to see, what did this device need to do, how did it need to perform. They described this single collection subdivided into two, and then everybody had a chance to look at the all the requirements as a whole, both the original SAMHSA requirements and the technical specifications, and then these new twists that were in the DOT ruling. Manufacturers had to then develop the device that could do what was required, had to then, finish their assays. These are the tests that are used to get married sort of with the device, and then have to get that FDA cleared together. And then the laboratories have to validate that combination, that device and those set of assays. And then once validated and FDA cleared, then those labs have to get inspected by HHS, right, SAMHSA. And so the holdup is that under the rules, you have to have two laboratories that are certified. One of them being the primary lab that can accept samples and do the testing, and then you need a second lab that is really the backup lab, or the laboratory that a sample can be sent to if there's a challenge. That B sample has to be sent out for a challenge test if one is required. And so we're waiting for those two labs to be certified. And here we are in July of 2024, and those. So far, we still don't actually have a device and a set of assays that are FDA cleared. We don't have, so therefore you don't have a laboratory that's certified, because that can't happen until there's an FDA cleared device and a set of assays. So that's all going on. And, my crystal ball on my desk says we're probably still looking at another couple of quarters, quarter three, quarter four. Anybody's guess. I'm thinking, we're still into 2025 in terms of when all that is done. The approval's done, the labs are a lab is certified, and the testing can actually begin. I'm not much of a gambling guy, Bill, so I'm thinking 2025.
Well, the Current Consulting Group does a survey of the drug testing industry every year, and we released the results of the survey at the NDASA conference, which we did this past May. And we did ask that question in the survey. Do you believe that the DOT oral fluid regulations will be available to use in 2025? And I think it was about 55% of the respondents said no, they didn't believe that would happen. So the industry sort of split half and half. Probably at this point, halfway through 2024, pretty optimistic to believe that, it's all going to be in place sometime in the next month or two, when we're not really seeing a whole lot of progress. But all of a sudden it could happen. I mean, these regulations were in the works for many, many years, as you know, and you were very involved in all of that with the Drug Testing Advisory Board. ORSHR played a big role there.
Sure.
But, we kept hearing that we were going to get oral fluid testing regulations for years. And then finally it happened, and sort of suddenly it happened. I guess it certainly wasn't an overnight thing by any means, but a lot of people, myself included, had become somewhat pessimistic about the reality of oral fluid testing regulations coming out of SAMHSA for one, and then DOT for the other. And I think, if you go into the nitty gritty of the DOT process, we can probably thank Patrice Kelly for all the work she did behind the scenes to get all the agencies together and to make it a reality. But now it's sort of up to the industry to get labs certified, to get, as you said, devices and assays FDA approved so that it can actually be used. Now, we're going to go into more detail about how this affects non-DOT drug testing. Of course, we're talking about DOT mandated drug testing and covered employers, et cetera. But there are a number of states, I think 18 states at my last count, that in the language of their state drug testing laws simply defer to the federal regulations. Now, some of them are pretty old laws, and they use antiquated terms like NIDA certified laboratories, for example. We don't use that term anymore. But a lot of these laws will simply defer to the federal regulations for how drug testing is conducted. And so de facto, all these years, under certain circumstances in these states, you could only do lab-based oral fluid testing, or lab-based urine testing, especially in these states with voluntary drug testing laws, like Tennessee, for example, very strict in terms of, in order to qualify for the workers' comp premium discount in the state of Tennessee, you must drug test like this. And basically, it was describing the Part 40 federal regulations. And so some of those states are going to be directly affected by these new regulations. And it seems to me, Brien, you tell me your opinion, but it seems to me that would open up the non-mandated market for even more oral fluid testing. We seem to see a movement toward oral fluid testing, but these guidelines seem to open that door a little bit more.
Oh yeah, absolutely, Bill. I mean, I think when I was at OraSure, I think one of the things that we were really excited about was the fact that, yes, it's a major boon to the industry, and it's a major help to the DOT and to those federal employees to have another matrix, another sample type that they can utilize for their drug testing programs, because there are a lot of applications that are difficult collection scenarios for the Department of Transportation, all those modals, those different transportation type employees, where sometimes a urine sample is just really hard to get or difficult, the remote locations, sometimes just the fact that people have difficulty providing a urine sample. But that is a finite, that's 5, maybe 6 million specimens. When you look at the overall market, the bigger part of the market, of course, is non-DOT testing. But there was always that fairly large portion of the market, even though some of it had adopted oral fluid testing for non-regulated testing. There was always a fairly large portion of non-regulated testing who looked to the DOT, looked to the federal testing guidelines as their guidepost, and weren't really moving to oral fluid because it wasn't accepted, or they had, they defer to the DOT in their policies as part of the way that they run their program. So a lot of them will now be able to do oral fluid testing and adopt it for their programs, and it'll make a big impact on the market, because there are so many benefits to using oral fluid, and it really helps the industry, and I think it will have a pretty significant impact on people's programs. It will allow people to do things they weren't able to do before. It will reduce drug test cheating. It will improve ROI on people's programs. It will allow them to be compliant, as we've talked about in some other some of our webinars. There are state laws coming about that actually are prohibiting the use of urine drug screening, because you're testing for the metabolite, which looks at past use, not current use. And of course, oral fluid looks at, current day use. And so there's so many reasons to look at oral fluid, and I think it really is one of the waves of the future for both non-DOT and DOT testing.
Yeah, I like to refer to oral fluid testing as the ultimate emerging technology. So, I mean, it was around for a long time, and there were many companies and many organizations, et cetera, that used oral fluid testing, but it was always sort of, still waiting to fully blossom in the markets, and now we're starting to see movement in that direction. Anything to add, Brien, before we close?
No, I think that's good, Bill. I think that really covers it, and we'll circle back and talk about some of these issues in the coming podcasts that we do.
Okay. Well, thank you again for joining us for this episode of Currently Speaking. Again, visit our website at currentconsultinggroup.com. You'll find back issues or episodes of Currently Speaking available there. Like us on all the various podcast platforms, and help us build up the followership for Currently Speaking. And with that, we'll conclude this episode. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.